Greetings, literature students. First of all, I wanted to praise you on the poetry papers that I've been going through. All excellent, and I wasn't sure how it was going to go with teaching rhythm and meter and form via online classes, how much I could get that over to you, but you handled it with aplomb. All of you were able to do a scansion and a rhyming scheme and determine prevailing meters for your poem. So I'm very pleased about that, and you all did very well. I know that some of you are still working on Oedipus the King, and that's fine. I'm sending these videos out on time just so that we don't have a snowball effect. But we're going to spend 2 weeks on this play. So there's going to be 2 videos today on the Cherry Orchard and 2 next week. Then the drama paper is going to come up fast. Now, with the drama paper, all you have to do is pick some element of either of the two plays. So if you decide to do Oedipus, you can get started on it and get it done. Or you can wait for the classes on the Cherry Orchard and see if something grabs your fancy on that. But it can be any aspect of either of the plays: a character study, scene study, speech study, anything you want to do with either of the 2 plays. So be thinking about that as you start looking at this next play. So for the first video, I'm just going to do a quick introduction. I don't expect you to have read much, and so basically this week, get stuck into it. Try and get half of it read if you can. I sent out some links yesterday. It's a bit harder to find this play online, but I did find a 80s version with Judi Dench, which is a very good film version on YouTube in 3 parts. So you'll have to play the parts. And then there is the full 90s version, which is also an interesting adaptation of the play, slightly darker, that's on a site that supposedly you can log in with your student ID and watch it for free. I haven't actually tested that out, so I apologize if that's not the case. There may be a version on Netflix or Prime. I know there was one on Prime. I'm not sure if it's still free, but of course I don't expect you to have those services. So if all else fails, watch the one on YouTube. There are also a couple of stage versions on there that you might find interesting as well. So the Cherry Orchard, we've come a long way in drama since Oedipus the King. We've moved from very performative drama that is also tied in with the religious rites. Remember I talked about worship of Dionysus by enacting a Greek play. Drama was taken over by the church in the Middle Ages, and then became, in the Renaissance and the Shakespearean Elizabethan era, a sort of return to the classical element. So you had the tragedies, comedies, and this new blend called tragicomedies. And it's still artifice. You can still tell when you're watching a play that you're watching something that's not real, something that's definitely artificial on the stage, with people overacting their parts. When we get into the 18th and 19th century, we have something called realism, where the sets became more real, reflecting reality. The artifice drops away. The idea of method acting or trying to be as authentic as possible in your role became a feature as well. And when we get to Chekhov, Anton Chekhov, a Russian playwright, 1860 to 1904, he's known as the father of social realism. So his plays are no longer about kings and queens and highborn people and heroes and adventures and dastardly deeds. It's more about normal people, about normal society. And he was kind of along with Henrik Ibsen, the inventor of the social realist play. So it's often about lower elements of society or the changing elements of society. And he was a medical doctor, so he wasn't strictly a writer first and foremost. He had another profession. The Cherry Orchard, which was first produced in 1904, so it's right at the beginning of the last century, was intended as a comedy/farce. And that's not something that comes across in most productions. Most productions tend to treat it as a tragedy, of sorts, a fall of a family. Chekhov really sort of intended it to be a bit on the bizarre side, as a farce. He was a blue-collar worker, which medical doctors were at that time. And this is a story of an aristocratic Russian landowner family losing their estate, their family estate, which is accorded them through history, that they have a right to. And you got to imagine Russia 10 years before the revolution. So you have this transition from Tsarist Russia, which is very much oligarchy, very striated class pronunciations between the rich and the poor, hardly any middle class. And then this growing bourgeoisie, upper middle class, becoming more and more material, becoming more rich by the day, and challenging the aristocracy, which is starting to fall away and maintain their status as the elites in society. And 1861, Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, abolished serfdom. So the servant class technically was done away with. It's sort of like the abolishment of slavery in the U.S. Technically, slavery was finished, but you still had sort of indentured servitude. So you still have the semblance of serfdom in Russia, and we see that in the character Fiers in the play. So let me give you a quick rundown of who's who, because the hardest thing about reading Russian literature, if you've ever read any Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, it takes half the book to get used to the names. They're very, very difficult. And in Russia you have a familiar name and a family name, or a formal name. So often the characters in the play are referenced by two different names, which can be confusing. So we have a group of characters that we gradually get to know in the first act. We have Lyubov, who's the Ravensky matriarch, the grieving mother who's lost her husband and her son, and she is the head of the family now, and reckless. She's not doing anything about this loss of her family estate. We have Trofimov, who's a perpetual student, a left-winger reformist. He's the new Russia, and he loves Anya. And Anya is a 17-year-old daughter that rescued her mother in Paris and brings her back to the estate. Also a sort of symbol of the newer Russia. She ends up in the story sort of distancing herself from her mother, although it takes the play to work that out. We have Pischik, a landowner in financial trouble, mooches off of the family, needs a bailout. Doesn't that sound like very much like today? So he's part of the aristocracy that's falling away, getting in trouble, losing their status. We have Varia, who's an adopted daughter, more of an estate manager. It's interesting that one of her daughters is almost like a princess, and the other one is almost like a serf in the family. Of course, the mother loves her, but there's a lot of difference between the two daughters of Lyubov. That's Varia, and she's linked to Lopukhin. We'll get to him in a minute. The brother Gayev is sort of old-fashioned, eccentric, talkative. He makes billiards references the whole play. And he also is a failed elite, isn't he? He just is useless in trying to rescue the family. Eventually it's pinned on him, and things don't go well. We have Charlotte, who's the eccentric governess from Germany, a magician, a ventriloquist, who is disconnected from her roots and very much an orphan. We have Lopukhin, who's the wealthy merchant from the servant class. So he's one of the new stars of Russia, rising up the social ladder, but also very much chained to his servitude roots. They come out in all of his speeches. So he becomes a wealthy merchant and eventually, supersedes the family. Then we have Epihodov, who is nicknamed 22 Calamities. He's a clumsy clerk that wants to marry Dunyasha, who's not interested in him. Sort of a suicidal figure in the play, a tragic figure, if you will. Dunyasha is the chambermaid who dresses like a lady. So we have this continuing obfuscation of class system in the play. She's dolled up and is reproached for it. She loves Yasha, who doesn't return her her affection. So we have sort of a love triangle between Epihodov, Dunyasha, and Yasha, who's the sort of predatory manservant, also a rising figure in the class system, prefers Paris to Russia, mocks the other servants, very dashing, handsome, but a user. Obviously he's just using Dunyasha, and it's not clear to her for some reason. Then we have Fiers, the muttering, senile servant, who oddly opposes the emancipation of the serfs, almost wants to go back to the old ways. And this is an interesting character because you get a lot of this in 19th century literature. People of lowly status who want to stay there. They don't want to rise in a new system. And then we have a series of minor characters in the play that are more or less perfunctory. Strangers, postmasters, the station master, the vagrant who comes along begging. So those are the characters in the play, and you'll get to know them in the first act, definitely by the second act, and I'll try to go through that in the next video. So just kind of as you read through the first couple of acts this week, look for themes, look for symbols, try to identify the plot arc and the interweaving subplots, which involve little triangles of characters in this very clever story, and hopefully that you'll find it enjoyable. Definitely a more modern play than the one that we read last week, so hopefully some of the themes are more familiar to you. Anyway, I'll end this video now. We'll move to the next video, and I'll talk about the sequence of plot. Okay.